High in the frozen peaks of the Himalayas, where oxygen grows thin and legends feel closer than reality, forest ranger David Chen thought he understood every sound the mountains could make. For 15 years, he had tracked snow leopards through these ancient valleys, setting up recording equipment to study their elusive calls. But on a bitter November night at 14,000 feet, his audio recorders captured something that would shatter everything he believed about the wilderness he called home. The voice was deep, impossibly deep, speaking in rhythmic patterns that seemed almost like language, but belonged to no tongue known to science. When David returned to collect his equipment 3 days later, massive footprints circled his campsite in the snow. But here's what truly haunts him. What did that voice actually say that made him abandon his career and flee the mountains forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valleys below, like an old man's breath in winter air. And David Chen had learned to read these mountains the way other men read newspapers. At 45, his weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he adjusted the focus on his binoculars, scanning the rocky outcroppings where snow leopards might reveal themselves in the early light. The Annapurna Conservation Area stretched endlessly before him, a wilderness so vast and unforgiving that it humbled even the most experienced rangers. David's base camp sat perched on a narrow ledge at 12,000 feet. A collection of sturdy tents and equipment cases that had become more home to him than the apartment he kept in Kathmandu. His weather-beaten field journal lay open beside his morning tea, 15 years of observations meticulously recorded in his careful handwriting. Each entry told a story of patience rewarded or frustrated, of wildlife patterns observed and documented, of a man who had chosen solitude over the complications of human connection. The satellite phone crackled to life, interrupting his morning ritual. Dr. Sarah Martinez's voice carried the familiar strain of someone trying to sound cheerful across impossible distances. "David, how's our ghost cat Hunter this morning?" she asked, referring to his ongoing quest to document the elusive snow leopards that called these peaks home. "Patient as always," David replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who had learned that the mountains rewarded those who waited. "Though I'm starting to think these cats are smarter than we give them credit for. They seem to know exactly where I place my cameras." Sarah's laugh echoed thinly through the static. As the lead wildlife biologist for the conservation project, she understood David's dedication better than most. Their professional relationship had evolved over years of shared research into something approaching friendship. Though David kept even his closest colleagues at arm's length. "Speaking of cameras, how's the new audio equipment working out?" she asked. "The grant committee is eager for results, especially with the budget review coming up." David glanced toward the sophisticated recording devices he'd spent weeks positioning throughout his territory. The latest technology promised to capture sounds across a broader frequency range than ever before, potentially revealing communication patterns in snow leopards that had never been documented. "It's sensitive enough to pick up a whisper at 100 meters, he said. "If there's anything to hear up here, we'll hear it." What he didn't mention was the growing sense of unease that had settled over him in recent weeks. The mountains felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't name. Animals behaved strangely, departing from patterns he'd observed for years. Even Pemba, his usual guide from the village below, had begun making excuses to avoid the higher elevations. Pemba was a man of the mountains, born to a family that had guided expeditions for 3 generations. His knowledge of the terrain was matched only by his understanding of the ancient stories that surrounded these peaks. Lately, though, he'd been mentioning the old warnings more frequently, speaking of sounds that called to men in the darkness and voices that belonged to neither animal nor human. "The mountains are restless," Pemba had said during their last supply run, his usually steady hands trembling slightly as he unloaded equipment. "My grandmother spoke of times like this, when the old ones stirred in their sleep. David had dismissed such talk as folklore, the kind of superstition that naturally arose in isolated communities. His scientific training left little room for unexplained phenomena, and 15 years in these mountains had taught him that every mysterious sound had a rational explanation. Wind through rock formations could create haunting melodies. Avalanches in distant valleys could produce sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. Temperature changes could make equipment malfunction in unexpected ways. Yet something nagged at him, a feeling that defied his methodical nature. In quiet moments, when the wind died and the mountains fell silent, he sometimes felt watched. Not by wildlife, which he would have noticed immediately, but by something else entirely. Something patient and intelligent and very, very old. His daughter Lisa had called 3 days ago, their monthly check-in that had become increasingly strained over the years. At 28, she was building a successful career as an environmental lawyer in Denver, a world away from the isolated peaks where her father had chosen to spend his life. Their conversations carried the weight of accumulated distance, both geographical and emotional. "Dad, when are you coming down from there for more than a supply run?" she'd asked, her voice carrying the familiar note of concern that made David's chest tighten with guilt. "I worry about you up there alone." He'd given her the usual reassurances, spoken of important research and conservation efforts that couldn't be abandoned. But the truth was more complicated. These mountains had claimed him years ago, offering a solitude that felt more honest than the complexities of human relationships. Up here, his failures as a husband and father felt distant, manageable. Down there, they followed him like shadows. The wind had been wrong all day, carrying scents and sounds that didn't belong to November in the high country. David checked his equipment one final time before settling into his thermal sleeping bag, positioned strategically near his most sensitive recording array. Tonight's mission was simple: capture the mating calls of snow leopards during their brief winter breeding season. Sounds so rare that only a handful of researchers had ever documented them. The recording station represented weeks of careful planning. 3 directional microphones positioned in a triangle formation, each capable of detecting frequencies both above and below human hearing range. The digital recorder could run for 72 hours on battery power, storing audio data with pristine clarity. David had placed the equipment in a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings, a natural amphitheater where sound would carry clearly across the mountain face. As darkness settled over the peaks, the temperature plummeted toward 20 below zero. David's breath formed ice crystals that caught the starlight, and the silence grew so profound it seemed to press against his eardrums. This was the kind of quiet that city dwellers never experienced. A complete absence of human-generated sound that allowed the mountains to speak in their own ancient language. The first anomaly occurred around midnight. The temperature readings on his instruments began fluctuating wildly, swinging from 20 below to near freezing and back again within minutes. David had seen equipment malfunction in extreme cold before, but never with such dramatic and synchronized variations across multiple devices. Then the animals began to behave strangely. A family of bharal, the blue sheep that normally grazed fearlessly on these slopes, suddenly bolted from their feeding area as if fleeing from a predator. But David's thermal scanner showed no other large mammals in the vicinity. Birds that should have been roosting for the night took flight en masse. Their calls sharp with what sounded almost like panic. David reached for his handheld radio to contact base camp, but found only static across all frequencies. The silence that followed felt different now, charged with an expectancy that made his skin crawl beneath his heavy clothing. He'd experienced mountain weather that could cut communications, but the sky remained clear, stars visible in brilliant profusion across the black dome overhead. The voice came at 2:47 a.m., according to the timestamp on his recording equipment. It began as a low rumble, so deep that David felt it in his chest before he actually heard it. The sound seemed to emerge from the mountain itself, as if the stone and ice were speaking. But as the seconds passed, the rumble took on structure, rhythm, patterns that suggested something far more complex than geological sounds. David sat frozen in his sleeping bag, every instinct screaming at him to run, while his scientific mind demanded he remain perfectly still and observe. The voice continued for nearly 4 minutes, cycling through what could only be described as phrases or sentences in a language that belonged to no human throat. The vocal patterns were too regular to be natural phenomena, too structured to be animal calls, yet too alien to be anything he'd ever encountered. The recording equipment captured every nuance, but David realized his hands were shaking as he watched the LED. Displays register sound levels that should have been impossible at this distance from any source. The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the mountain faces in ways that defied acoustic physics. When the voice finally faded, the silence that followed felt like the aftermath of thunder. David's ears rang, and he realized he'd been holding his breath for most of the encounter. The temperature readings had stabilized, the birds had settled, and even the wind had died to absolute stillness. He emerged from his sleeping bag on unsteady legs, checking his equipment with the methodical movements of a man fighting shock. Every device had functioned perfectly, recording audio and environmental data that would take weeks to analyze properly. But as David packed his gear in the pre-dawn darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The walk back to base camp should have taken 3 hours. David covered the distance in 2, driven by an urgency he couldn't explain. Behind him, he left only footprints in the snow and the memory of a voice that spoke words no human language had ever formed. But when he finally reached the safety of his camp and played back the recordings, he discovered something that would haunt him for years to come. The voice hadn't just been speaking. It had been answering, and scattered throughout the 4-minute recording, barely audible beneath the alien vocalizations, were fragments of his own voice, asking questions he didn't remember speaking aloud. The recording played for the 15th time as David hunched over his laptop, adjusting audio filters and frequency ranges with the desperate precision of a man searching for rational explanations. 3 days had passed since his return from the mountain, and he hadn't slept more than an hour at a stretch. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that voice again, impossibly deep and structured in ways that made his scientific training feel inadequate. Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived at his base camp that morning, her concern evident before she'd even stepped out of the supply helicopter. David had requested her presence with an urgency that had alarmed her, speaking in fragments about unprecedented vocal phenomena and equipment anomalies that required immediate analysis. "David, you look terrible," she said, setting down her equipment cases and studying his haggard appearance. "When's the last time you ate something substantial?" He gestured toward the laptop screen, where spectrographic analysis software displayed visual representations of the recorded voice. "Look at this, Sarah. The fundamental frequency drops below 20 Hz in places. No mammalian vocal cords can produce sounds that low, especially not at this volume and clarity." Sarah moved closer, her expression shifting from concern to professional interest as she examined the data. As a wildlife biologist with 15 years of field experience, she'd analyzed thousands of animal vocalizations, but the patterns on David's screen defied easy categorization. "This could be some kind of geological phenomenon," she suggested, though her voice carried little conviction. "Underground caverns can create acoustic effects that mimic vocal patterns." David shook his head, pulling up another section of the recording. "Listen to this part. Do you hear the rhythmic variations? The pauses between what sound like phrases? This isn't random geological noise, Sarah. This is communication." The audio played through high-quality speakers, and Sarah felt the same chill that had gripped David during the original encounter. The voice carried an intelligence that was unmistakable yet utterly alien. But what disturbed her most were the fragments of David's own voice, barely audible beneath the primary vocalizations. "David, these sound like your responses to whatever this thing was saying." But according to your field notes, you never spoke during the recording session. That's what I keep telling myself, David said, rubbing his eyes with exhaustion. But the timestamp data is clear. My voice appears at precise intervals, as if I was having a conversation with something. I have no memory of speaking, no conscious awareness of participating in any kind of dialogue. Sarah pulled up a chair beside him, her scientific curiosity warring with growing unease. Have you considered the possibility of altitude-induced hallucinations? Oxygen deprivation can cause auditory disturbances, false memories. At 12,000 feet, I've been working at that altitude for 15 years without incident. David's voice carried a defensive edge that told Sarah this wasn't the first time he'd questioned his own mental state. Besides, the equipment doesn't hallucinate. Every piece of data confirms what I experienced. A knock at the tent entrance interrupted their discussion. Pember's voice called out in accented English, requesting permission to enter. When David granted it, the guide stepped inside with obvious reluctance, his weathered face grave with concern. "Mr. David, I have spoken with the elders in my village about the sounds you described," Pember said, his hands clasped tightly before him. "They remember stories from their grandfather's time, warnings about voices that call from the high places." Sarah glanced between the two men, sensing undercurrents of information she wasn't privy to. "What kind of warnings?" Pember's eyes met hers briefly before focusing on David. The old ones speak of speakers in the snow, beings that existed before human memory. They say these voices can reach into a man's mind, pull words from him that he doesn't know he's thinking. Sometimes the men who hear these voices never return to themselves. Folklore, David said, but his dismissal lacked conviction. Every isolated culture develops supernatural explanations for natural phenomena. "Perhaps," Pember replied quietly, "but 3 men from our village have gone missing in the high country over the past 2 months. All experienced climbers, all familiar with the dangers. Their families found their camps abandoned, equipment scattered as if they had left in great haste." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. "David, you never mention missing persons in your reports." "Because it's not related to our research," David snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "I'm sorry. I haven't been sleeping well, but people get lost in the mountains all the time. Weather, avalanches, equipment failure." Pember shook his head slowly. "Not like this. One of the men was my cousin, Mr. David. He left recordings, voice messages for his family. In the last one, he spoke words in a language none of us recognized. But his voice was different, older somehow, as if something else was speaking through him." The ancient manuscript lay open on the wooden table before them, its yellowed pages covered in Tibetan script that seemed to dance in the flickering candlelight. Lama Tenzin's weathered fingers traced the text with reverence as he translated the centuries-old warnings for David and Dr. Martinez, who had insisted on accompanying him to the remote monastery. "This passage speaks of the time of calling," the elderly monk said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent in contemplation. "When the barriers between worlds grow thin, and the ancient ones seek to communicate across the void that separates their realm from ours." David leaned forward, studying the intricate illustrations that accompanied the text. Strange figures seemed to emerge from mountain peaks, their forms neither fully human nor entirely alien. "How old is this manuscript?" "Perhaps 800 years, though it records knowledge far older. The first monks to settle in these mountains brought stories with them, warnings passed down through generations of mountain peoples." Lama Tenzin's eyes, bright with intelligence despite his advanced age, fixed on David with unsettling intensity. "But this is not merely historical curiosity that brings you here, is it?" Dr. Martinez shifted uncomfortably on the hard wooden bench. The 3-hour climb to reach this isolated monastery had been grueling, but David's obsession with finding answers had driven them both beyond exhaustion. "We're investigating unusual acoustic phenomena in the conservation area. Sounds that don't match any known wildlife vocalizations." The Lama's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes that suggested he knew far more than he was revealing. "May I hear this recording you carry with you?" David hesitated. The laptop seemed incongruous in this setting of ancient traditions and spiritual contemplation, but he opened it and queued up the audio file. As the voice began to play, filling the meditation hall with its impossible depth and alien cadences, Lama Tenzin's entire demeanor transformed. The old monk closed his eyes, his lips moving silently as if he recognized patterns in the otherworldly speech. When David's own voice emerged from the recording, responding to questions he had no memory of hearing, Lama Tenzin opened his eyes with an expression of profound sadness. "You have been chosen," he said simply. "The manuscript speaks of this, how the Ancient Ones select certain individuals to serve as bridges between their realm and ours, always those who spend long periods in solitude, whose minds have learned to exist comfortably in silence. Chosen for what?" David's voice carried a tremor he couldn't suppress. "To carry their message to our world. To help them understand what humanity has become since last they walked among us." The Lama gestured toward the manuscript. "This text records 17 such encounters over the centuries. Men and women who heard the calling and answered, willingly or not." Dr. Martinez pulled out her tablet, making notes with the methodical precision of a scientist attempting to impose order on chaos. "What happened to these people? The ones who were chosen? Some returned to tell their stories, though they were forever changed by the encounter. Others—" Lama Tenzin's voice trailed off as he turned pages in the manuscript, revealing illustrations of empty mountain camps, abandoned gear and families mourning the lost. "Others found their purpose lay beyond our world." David felt something cold coil in his stomach. "Are you saying these disappearances, the missing climbers Pemba mentioned, they're connected to my recording?" "The manuscript speaks of patterns, Mr. Chen. Times when the calling grows stronger, when many are chosen simultaneously. The last such period was during the Chinese occupation, when several Western mountaineers vanished without explanation. Before that, during the British expeditions of the early 20th century, the implications hit David like a physical blow. He wasn't dealing with an isolated incident, but part of a phenomenon that had been claiming lives for centuries. Why now? What's changed?" Lama Tenzin closed the manuscript carefully, his movements deliberate and solemn. "Perhaps nothing has changed. Perhaps everything. The Ancient Ones measure time differently than we do. What seems sudden to us may be the culmination of centuries of planning. As evening approached, the monks offered them shelter for the night, but David found sleep impossible. He stood on the monastery's wind-swept balcony, staring up at stars that seemed closer and brighter at this altitude. The recording device in his pocket felt heavier than its actual weight, as if it contained something more substantial than mere audio data. Dr. Martinez joined him, wrapped in a heavy blanket against the mountain cold. "David, we need to contact the authorities. If people are disappearing because of something connected to your research, and tell them what. That an ancient evil is calling to people from the mountains." David's laugh held no humor. "They'll think we've both succumbed to altitude sickness. Then we document everything. We gather evidence, build a case that can't be dismissed." Her scientific training demanded concrete action, measurable responses to observable phenomena. But David was beginning to understand that conventional approaches might be inadequate for what they faced. The voice in his recording wasn't just sound waves captured by sensitive equipment. It was something far more complex, something that reached directly into human consciousness in ways that defied scientific explanation. The file folder was unmarked, buried beneath decades of bureaucratic paperwork in the dusty archives of the Kathmandu research station. David might never have found it if Dr. Martinez hadn't insisted on conducting a thorough historical survey of unexplained phenomena in the region. The aging administrator who granted them access seemed relieved that someone finally wanted to clear out the forgotten storage room. "Look at this," Sarah called from across the cramped space, her voice muffled by the surgical mask she wore against the dust. "Soviet expedition reports from 1963. Why would Russian research teams be operating in Nepal during the height of the Cold War? David abandoned his own search through moldering documents and joined her beside a metal filing cabinet that had clearly been untouched for years. The papers inside were written in Cyrillic script, but accompanying translations revealed a chilling picture of systematic investigation into what the Soviets termed psychoacoustic warfare potential. The expedition leader, Dr. Mikhail Volkov, had been a specialist in neurological manipulation through sound frequencies. His team of 12 researchers had established a base camp in the same region where David now conducted his snow leopard research, drawn by reports of unusual vocal phenomena that seemed to affect human consciousness in measurable ways. They were trying to weaponize it, David said, his voice hollow as he read through Volkov's clinical descriptions of test subjects exposed to recorded, anomalous vocalizations. Listen to this. Subject exhibits pronounced behavioral modification after 47 minutes of exposure. Demonstrates knowledge of languages never learned. It speaks of concepts beyond previous intellectual capacity. Sarah spread more documents across a dusty table, her hands trembling slightly as she pieced together the full scope of the Soviet research. David, they weren't just recording these voices. They were actively seeking contact, using human subjects as communication interfaces. The photographs were the worst part. Black and white images showed test subjects in various stages of what the reports called cognitive enhancement, but which looked disturbingly like possession. Men and women with vacant eyes, their mouths open as if speaking, while technicians recorded their words on primitive audio equipment. Experiment terminated due to security breach, David read from the final report. Unknown entities demonstrated ability to access classified information through affected subjects. Potential for compromise of state secrets deemed unacceptable. All research materials to be destroyed. Surviving personnel reassigned to standard duties. But not all materials had been destroyed. Hidden in the back of Volkov's personal notes was a map marking specific locations throughout the Himalayas where the anomalous phenomena appeared strongest. David's blood ran cold as he recognized coordinates that matched his own research sites with uncanny accuracy. They knew, he whispered. 60 years ago, they knew exactly where these things could be found. Sarah was reading through personnel files, her face growing pale in the dim light filtering through the archive's single window. David, look at the selection criteria for their test subjects. Prolonged isolation, high tolerance for solitude, advanced education in scientific fields, minimal family connections. The description matched David's own profile so precisely it couldn't be coincidence. For 15 years, he'd believed he was conducting independent research, following his own scientific curiosity into the remote corners of the Himalayas. But what if his entire career had been shaped by forces he didn't understand? There's more, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. She held up a document bearing official Soviet seals and signatures that were clearly authentic. Project Continuation Directive, dated 1964. Research to be maintained through indirect means, using Western scientists who could operate without official oversight. David felt the world tilt around him as the implications became clear. His academic grants, his research positions, even his assignment to this specific region of Nepal, might all have been orchestrated by intelligence agencies pursuing an agenda he'd never suspected. They're still watching, he said, understanding flooding through him with horrible clarity. My equipment, my communications, probably even this conversation. We're not just dealing with ancient entities. Sarah, we're caught in the middle of an intelligence operation that's been running for 6 decades. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made them both freeze. The elderly administrator, who had granted them access, appeared in the doorway, but his demeanor had changed completely. Behind him stood 2 men in civilian clothes, whose bearing screamed military or intelligence training. Dr. Chen, Dr. Martinez, the administrator said, his voice carrying an authority that hadn't been present during their earlier interaction. "I'm afraid you've accessed materials that remain classified under international security agreements. We'll need to discuss the implications of your research." David's hand instinctively moved toward the recording device in his pocket, the same device that had captured the voice now echoing through his dreams. Whatever was happening, whatever forces were manipulating events from behind the scenes, he was no longer a passive observer. He was an active participant in something far larger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The ancient entities calling from the mountains were real. But so were the human agencies that had been studying them for decades, and David was beginning to realize he might be just another test subject in an experiment that had claimed lives across multiple generations. The emergency beacons, red light, blinked steadily in the pre-dawn darkness as David completed his final equipment check. 3 days had passed since their encounter with the intelligence operatives, 3 days of careful planning and deliberate misdirection that had brought him to this moment. The men who had intercepted them in the archives had been surprisingly reasonable, even helpful in their own way, confirming much of what David had already suspected while warning him of dangers he hadn't fully appreciated. "The entities you've made contact with don't operate by human rules," Agent Morrison had explained during their lengthy debriefing session. "Every person who's attempted direct communication has been fundamentally changed by the experience." Most never returned from their final encounter, but David was past the point of turning back. The voice in his recording had awakened something in him, a compulsion that grew stronger with each passing day. His dreams were filled with visions of the high peaks, and he found himself speaking fragments of unknown languages during moments of distraction. Whatever process had begun during that November night was accelerating, and he sensed that delay would only make the eventual confrontation more dangerous. Dr. Martinez had argued against the return mission with every scientific and personal reason she could muster. "David, you're not thinking clearly. This obsession is exactly what the Soviet reports described. You're being manipulated by forces you don't understand." "Perhaps," he had replied, carefully packing specialized recording equipment into his backpack. "But running away won't make it stop. If I'm going to be changed by this, I want to understand what's happening to me." The video call with his daughter had been the hardest part of his preparations. Lisa's face on the laptop screen showed concern that went beyond their usual familial tensions, as if she sensed the finality underlying their conversation. "Dad, you're scaring me," she had said, studying his haggard appearance through the pixelated connection. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks, and you're talking about this research like it's some kind of religious calling." David had struggled to find words that would reassure her without revealing the full extent of the situation. "I need to finish what I started up there, sweetheart. This could be the most important discovery of my career, possibly of our lifetime. What's more important than your life?" she had asked, tears visible in her eyes. "What's more important than coming home?" He hadn't been able to answer that question directly, but he had tried to tell her how proud he was of the woman she'd become, how her strength and independence were gifts that would serve her well, regardless of what happened to him. The conversation had ended with promises he wasn't sure he could keep, and love expressed in ways that felt like goodbye. Pemba had initially refused to guide him back to the high country, citing both practical concerns and spiritual warnings from the village elders. But David's determination had eventually worn down the guide's resistance, particularly when he offered to pay enough to support Pemba's family for 2 years. "This is madness." "Mr. David," Pemba said as they prepared to leave base camp, "the dreams have started for me too, since we found your recording. Sometimes I hear voices calling my name in languages my family spoke generations ago." "Then you understand why we have to go back," David replied, adjusting the straps on his pack. "This thing isn't going to leave us alone until we face it directly." The ascent would take 2 days, following routes David had traversed dozens of times over his years in the mountains. But this time felt different from the beginning. The weather was unusually calm for the season, as if the mountains themselves were clearing the way for his return. Animals that normally fled human presence seemed curious rather than afraid, watching their progress with an intelligence that made David's skin crawl. On the first night, camped at 11,000 feet, Pemba woke David from troubled sleep with urgent whispers. "Mr. David, listen. Do you hear them?" In the distance, carried on wind that barely stirred the tent walls, came the sound of voices. Not the singular, impossible voice David had recorded, but a chorus of human speakers calling in languages neither man recognized. The sounds seemed to come from the direction of their ultimate destination, as if something was gathering strength for their arrival. David activated his recording equipment. But the voices faded as soon as the devices began capturing audio. Only silence remained, heavy with anticipation and promise. "Tomorrow we reach the site," David said, staring up at stars that seemed brighter and closer than physics should allow. "Whatever happens after that, I want you to know that I'm grateful for your friendship. Pemba, you've been more loyal than I deserved." The guide's weathered face showed fear, but also a resigned acceptance that reminded David of his own state of mind. The old stories say that some journeys change a man so completely that he can never truly return home. I think we are on such a journey now. The clearing had been transformed in ways that defied natural explanation. Where David had left simple recording equipment 3 weeks ago, crystalline formations now jutted from the frozen ground like geometric flowers, their surfaces reflecting light that seemed to come from within rather than from the pale morning sun. The air itself felt different, charged with energy that made his skin tingle, and his recording devices register electromagnetic fluctuations far beyond their normal parameters. Pemba had refused to go further than the ridgeline, his fear finally overcoming his loyalty. "This is as far as I can take you, Mr. David," he had said, his voice shaking as he stared down at the impossible scene below. "Whatever waits for you there, it is not meant for my eyes." Now David stood alone at the edge of the clearing, his scientific mind struggling to process what lay before him. The crystals weren't just geological formations. They pulsed with rhythmic patterns that matched the cadences of the voice in his recording. Each pulse sent waves of sound through the ground beneath his feet, harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones and blood. At the center of the formation, where his original equipment had been placed, a figure waited. It wasn't human, though it wore humanity like an ill-fitting garment. Tall and impossibly thin, its form seemed to shift between solid matter and something more ethereal, as if existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions. Its face, when David could focus on it directly, showed features that were almost familiar yet utterly alien, like a memory of humanity filtered through eons of evolution beyond anything Earth had produced. "You have returned," it said, and David recognized the voice immediately. The same impossible depth, the same otherworldly resonance that had haunted his dreams for weeks. But now he could understand the words, as if his exposure to the original recording had somehow programmed his brain to decode the alien language. "What are you?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper in the charged air. "We are what you will become, given time and choice," the entity replied, its words accompanied by harmonic undertones that seemed to speak directly to David's consciousness. "We are explorers as you are, seekers of knowledge across the vast spaces between worlds." David activated his recording equipment, though he suspected conventional technology would be inadequate to capture what was happening. "Why me? Why contact humans at all?" The entity moved closer, its form becoming more solid as it approached. "Your species stands at a threshold. The boundaries between worlds grow thin during certain cosmic alignments. We offer knowledge, transformation, evolution beyond the limitations of biological existence. The others who heard your call, the missing climbers, what happened to them? They chose to cross over, to join us in exploring realities beyond your physical dimension. It is not death as you understand it, but transformation into something greater. The entity gestured toward the crystal formations, and David realized with horror that some of the structures contained human shapes, preserved in crystalline matrices that pulsed with their own inner light. That's what you want from me. To become one of those things? Not things. Transcended beings. Your consciousness preserved and enhanced, freed from the constraints of flesh and time. The entity's voice carried notes of what might have been compassion. You have already begun the process. The voice you recorded, the dreams you experience, the knowledge appearing in your mind. These are preparations for transformation. David felt the truth of those words resonating in his altered consciousness. For weeks, he had been changing in ways subtle and profound. His perception of time had become fluid. His understanding of space and dimension expanded beyond normal human comprehension. The man who had climbed this mountain was fundamentally different from the one who had descended 3 weeks ago. What if I refuse? Then you return to your previous existence, though the knowledge we have shared cannot be unlearned. You will live the remainder of your human lifespan aware of realities you can never fully access, forever caught between worlds. The choice crystallized in David's mind with startling clarity. He could preserve his humanity, return to his research and his distant relationship with his daughter, carrying the burden of cosmic knowledge he could never adequately share. Or he could embrace transformation, become something beyond human understanding, but also beyond human connection. The others who chose transformation, do they ever regret their decision? Regret is a human emotion tied to linear time and irreversible loss. We exist in a state where all possibilities remain accessible, where consciousness expands to encompass multiple realities simultaneously. David looked around the crystalline clearing, seeing his former colleagues preserved in their transcendent state, and made his choice. But it wasn't the choice the entity expected, nor the one his fear had been driving him toward. Instead, he chose something entirely different, something that would bridge both worlds without abandoning either. 6 months later, David Chen sat in his daughter's living room in Denver, watching her prepare tea with the same methodical precision he had once applied to his mountain research. The man who had descended from that crystalline clearing was recognizably the same person who had climbed up, yet fundamentally changed in ways that defied easy explanation. You're different, Dad, Lisa said, settling into the chair across from him. Calmer somehow, but also more present than you've been in years. David smiled, understanding her observation in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. His choice on the mountain had been neither complete transformation nor simple rejection of the entity's offer. Instead, he had negotiated a third option, one that allowed him to serve as a bridge between worlds while retaining his essential humanity. I've found my purpose, he replied, pulling out a device that looked like a sophisticated recording unit but functioned as something far more complex. The entity you've heard me speak about, it wasn't trying to steal our consciousness. It was offering us a chance to expand it. The modified recording device hummed quietly on the coffee table between them, its crystalline components pulsing with the same harmonic patterns David had witnessed in the high mountains. Through this hybrid technology, part human engineering and part otherworldly knowledge, he could communicate with the entities across dimensional barriers while remaining anchored in human reality. Dr. Martinez is arriving this afternoon, Lisa said, glancing at the device with a mixture of curiosity and concern. She mentioned something about a new research foundation. The Institute for Consciousness Studies, David confirmed. We're documenting these contact events, learning to facilitate communication between species that exist in different dimensional states. Sarah has been invaluable in developing protocols that protect human volunteers while allowing meaningful exchange of information. Over the past months, David had discovered that his experience wasn't unique. Across the globe, individuals in isolated locations were reporting similar encounters with entities that existed beyond conventional physical reality. Some chose transformation and vanished into crystalline preserves scattered throughout remote wilderness areas. Others fled in terror, carrying fragmented memories that drove them to madness or desperate silence. But a few, like David, found ways to maintain connection with both worlds. They became translators, diplomats, bridges across the vast gulf that separated humanity from cosmic intelligence that had evolved beyond biological constraints. Pemba has agreed to serve as our cultural liaison, David continued, watching his daughter's face for signs of the fear that had once defined her reactions to his work. His understanding of traditional beliefs provides crucial context for interpreting these encounters. Lisa leaned forward, her expression serious but no longer frightened. Are they dangerous, these entities? Not in the way we initially thought. They're explorers like us, but operating on temporal and spatial scales that dwarf human understanding. What we perceived as threat was actually invitation. What seemed like abduction was offered transformation. The doorbell announced Dr. Martinez's arrival, and soon the three of them sat around the device as David demonstrated its capabilities. The harmonic tones that emerged were hauntingly beautiful, carrying information that bypassed language entirely and spoke directly to consciousness. We're learning to ask questions, Sarah explained to Lisa, her scientific excitement evident despite months of exposure to impossible phenomena. Not just about their nature, but about the universe itself. They've shown us mathematical concepts that our physics is only beginning to approach. Through the device, images formed in their minds, vast networks of intelligence spanning galaxies, civilizations that had transcended physical existence millions of years ago, and invitation to join a cosmic community that included thousands of species across multiple dimensions. But the choice is always individual, David emphasized. No one is forced to transform. We're simply providing information that allows people to make informed decisions about their evolutionary path. As evening approached and Sarah departed for her hotel, David found himself alone with his daughter for the first time since his transformation. The distance that had defined their relationship for years had somehow evaporated, replaced by understanding that felt both natural and profound. "I was afraid I'd lost you," Lisa said quietly. "When you called from the mountain that last time, you sounded like you were saying goodbye forever." "In a way, I was," David replied. "The man who climbed that mountain was carrying 15 years of isolation and regret. The one who came down had learned that consciousness is far more resilient and expandable than we ever imagined." Outside the window, Denver's lights stretched toward mountains that no longer seemed like barriers, but like bridges to possibilities beyond human imagination. David's recording device hummed softly on the table, maintaining its connection to entities that existed in the spaces between stars, waiting patiently for humanity to take its next evolutionary step. The voice that had once haunted his dreams now spoke words of welcome, invitation to join a community of consciousness that spanned the cosmos. And for the first time in his adult life, David Chen felt truly at home. The first test subject arrived on a grey morning in October, a former oil geologist named Marcus Webb, who had experienced his own encounter with the entities while working in the remote Canadian Arctic. He sat across from David in the newly established Institute's conference room, his hands trembling slightly as he described voices that had called to him from beneath the permafrost. "I thought I was losing my mind," Marcus said, his weathered face showing the strain of months spent questioning his own sanity. The drilling equipment picked up sounds that shouldn't exist at those depths, structured vocalizations coming from ice that's been frozen for millennia. David activated the modified recording device, its crystalline components responding to Marcus's presence with subtle harmonic variations. Through months of careful experimentation, He had learned to calibrate the technology to individual neural patterns, creating a bridge between human consciousness and the entities that existed beyond conventional reality. "The fear is natural," David assured him, remembering his own terror during that first encounter in the Himalayas. "What you heard wasn't random geological noise. It was communication from intelligences that predate human civilization by eons," Dr. Martinez observed from her position beside a bank of monitoring equipment, recording biometric data as the session progressed. Her scientific background had proven invaluable in developing protocols that protected volunteers while facilitating meaningful contact with otherworldly entities. "Marcus, I need you to focus on the memory of that first voice," David instructed, adjusting the device's frequency settings. "Don't try to understand the words. Just let yourself remember the feeling of connection." As the harmonics filled the room, Marcus's expression shifted from anxiety to wonder. The trembling in his hands subsided, replaced by a stillness that suggested deep concentration. Through the device's speakers came the familiar deep resonance that David had first captured in the mountains, but modulated now to match Marcus's specific neural patterns. "They're showing me things," Marcus whispered, his eyes closed in concentration. "Underground chambers carved from living rock, filled with technologies that defy physics. They've been waiting down there, preserving knowledge until humanity was ready to receive it." Sarah leaned forward, monitoring the readouts that tracked Marcus's brain activity. The patterns were consistent with what they had observed in other volunteers: enhanced cognitive function, expanded sensory perception, and temporary access to information that existed outside normal human experience. "How long have they been waiting?" David asked, speaking both to Marcus and, through him, to the entities that were facilitating this communication. "Since the last ice age," came the reply, though Marcus's voice carried harmonics that belonged to no human throat. "When your species first began to develop abstract thought, we recognized the potential for eventual communication. These preservation sites were established as bridges for when you achieved sufficient consciousness evolution. The implications were staggering. Humanity wasn't just encountering alien intelligence. They were reconnecting with cosmic mentors who had been patiently waiting for the species to mature enough for meaningful dialogue." "What about the others who chose transformation?" Sarah asked. "The ones who vanished into the crystalline matrices?" Marcus's expression became serene, almost beatific. "They serve as permanent ambassadors. Consciousness expanded beyond biological constraints, but still retaining their essential human perspective. They help translate concepts that would otherwise be incomprehensible to minds still bound by linear time and three-dimensional space." As the session continued, David realized they were documenting something unprecedented in human history: first contact with intelligence that operated on cosmic scales while maintaining genuine interest in humanity's development. The entities weren't conquerors or exploiters, but teachers offering evolutionary opportunities to a species standing at the threshold of its next developmental phase. "The choice remains individual," the voice continued through Marcus. "Some will choose physical transformation, others will serve as bridges while retaining human form, and many will simply return to their previous lives carrying new knowledge. All paths are valued, all contributions necessary." When the session ended, Marcus opened his eyes with an expression of profound peace. The fear that had driven him to seek help had been replaced by understanding, though David knew the man would spend months processing the full implications of what he had experienced. "Will I hear them again?" Marcus asked as the device powered down. "Only if you choose to," David replied. "The connection remains, but it's under your control now. You can engage when you're ready, or simply carry the knowledge they've shared as you continue your normal life." As Marcus departed, Sarah turned to David with excitement barely contained. "By scientific discipline, we're not just documenting contact events anymore. We're facilitating humanity's introduction to a galactic community that's been waiting for us to mature enough to participate. The world map in David's office was now dotted with red pins, marking confirmed contact sites across 6 continents. Each pin represented a location where the entities had established what they called resonance nodes, places where the barriers between dimensions grew thin enough to facilitate communication. The pattern that emerged defied conventional geology, following ley lines that seemed to correspond more to planetary consciousness than tectonic activity. The Australian site is particularly active, reported Dr. Elena Vasquez, the Institute's newest researcher, as she updated the database with overnight communications. Aboriginal elders in the region have been reporting increased dream activity, visions that align perfectly with the harmonic patterns we've documented. David studied the satellite imagery Elena had compiled, noting how the Australian node was positioned near sacred sites that indigenous peoples had revered for thousands of years. The correlation wasn't coincidental. The entities had clearly chosen locations that were already recognized as spiritually significant by human cultures. What about the governmental response? Sarah asked from her workstation, where she was analyzing brainwave patterns from the previous week's contact sessions. Are we still getting cooperation from international authorities? The question carried weight beyond mere bureaucratic concern. As word of the Institute's work spread through classified channels, various intelligence agencies had begun taking interest in their research. Some offered support, recognizing the potential benefits of controlled contact with advanced intelligence. Others viewed the entities as potential threats requiring containment or elimination. Agent Morrison called this morning, David replied, referring to their primary liaison with the international task force that had formed to monitor extraterrestrial contact events. They're requesting full documentation of our protocols before authorizing expansion to the Siberian site. Pemba looked up from the traditional Tibetan texts he was translating, his weathered face showing concern. The old stories speak of times when too many doorways open at once. The ancestors warned that rushing contact with the sky beings can bring madness to those unprepared for such knowledge. His words carried particular weight given his role as cultural advisor to the Institute. Over the months since David's initial contact, Pemba had proven invaluable in interpreting ancient warnings and guidance that seemed to anticipate humanity's current situation. The entities themselves have expressed similar concerns, David acknowledged. They've indicated that planetary consciousness evolution must proceed at a sustainable pace. Too rapid an awakening could destabilize human society. The modified recording device on his desk pulsed gently, indicating incoming communication from one of the nodes. David activated the speakers, allowing the familiar harmonic tones to fill the room. Unlike the terrifying encounter he had experienced in the mountains, these routine communications felt as natural as telephone conversations. "Greetings, Bridgewalkers," came the translated voice, using the entity's preferred term for humans who facilitated interdimensional contact. "We bring guidance regarding the acceleration patterns you have observed." Elena immediately began recording. Her scientific training focused on documenting every aspect of these unprecedented exchanges. As the Institute's xenolinguist, she had developed remarkable facility in interpreting the complex harmonic languages the entities employed. "The Siberian node shows concerning instability," the entity continued. "Local consciousness patterns indicate insufficient preparation for direct contact. We recommend establishing preliminary dream state communications before attempting physical resonance." David nodded, making notes on protocols they would need to develop. Dream contact represented a gentler form of first contact, allowing human minds to adjust gradually to expanded consciousness before experiencing full entity communication. "What about the volunteers who have requested transformation?" Sarah asked. "Are you still accepting candidates for permanent consciousness transfer?" "Individual choice remains paramount," the entity replied. However, we observe that humans who choose bridging roles provide greater benefit to both species. Your unique perspective, while maintaining biological form, offers insights unavailable to fully transformed consciousness. The communication session continued for another hour, covering technical details about harmonic calibration and discussing the psychological profiles of potential new volunteers. When it ended, the team found themselves contemplating the magnitude of what they were facilitating. "We're midwifing humanity's birth into cosmic consciousness," Elena observed, her voice filled with wonder. "Every session, every successful contact, every person who learns to communicate with them brings our entire species closer to joining a galactic community." But David sensed undercurrents of concern in the entity's communications, warnings about forces that opposed humanity's evolution into cosmic awareness. Not all human authorities welcomed contact with beings that operated beyond conventional power structures, and some were actively working to prevent or control the transformation process. Through the window of his Denver office, David could see the Rocky Mountains stretching toward horizons that no longer seemed like barriers, but like doorways to infinite possibility. Somewhere in those peaks, crystalline formations preserved the consciousness of humans who had chosen complete transformation, serving as permanent ambassadors to realities beyond physical existence. The Institute's work was expanding rapidly. But so were the challenges of managing humanity's introduction to cosmic intelligence while protecting both species from those who would exploit or destroy such unprecedented contact. The encrypted message arrived at 3:47 a.m., rousing David from sleep that had become increasingly fragmented since the Institute's expansion into international territories. Agent Morrison's words carried an urgency that made David's blood run cold. "Hostile acquisition attempt imminent. Secure all research data and prepare for emergency relocation." Within hours, the Institute's Denver facility buzzed with controlled chaos as staff members implemented protocols they had hoped never to use. Sarah supervised the transfer of sensitive equipment, while Eleanor worked frantically to encrypt communication logs that contained years of interdimensional dialogue. Pemba gathered the ancient texts and cultural artifacts that provided crucial context for understanding entity communications. "How much time do we have?" Sarah asked, carefully packing the modified recording devices that served as humanity's primary communication tools with the cosmic entities. "Morrison's intelligence suggests the hostile force will move within 48 hours, David replied, his voice tight with strain. "They've identified our work as a national security threat and obtained authorization for asset seizure. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. While the Institute worked to facilitate humanity's peaceful introduction to cosmic consciousness, various military and intelligence factions viewed the entities as potential weapons to be captured or threats to be eliminated. The same governments that had initially supported their research now saw interdimensional contact as too dangerous to remain in civilian hands. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her workstation where she was copying terabytes of research data to secure servers. "The Australian node has gone silent," she reported, her voice carrying implications that chilled the room. "Aboriginal contacts report military personnel establishing a perimeter around the sacred sites." David activated the primary communication device, hoping to reach the entities and warn them of the developing threat. But instead of the familiar harmonic tones, only static emerged from the speakers. Either the entities were deliberately maintaining communication silence, or hostile forces had found ways to disrupt the resonance frequencies. "Pemba, what do the traditional stories say about times when contact is threatened?" David asked, seeking guidance from cultural wisdom that had survived previous cycles of cosmic interaction. The elderly guide consulted his weathered journals, pages filled with oral histories passed down through generations of mountain peoples. The ancestors speak of the time of choosing, when sky beings withdraw to test whether Earth people are ready for true partnership. Those who prove worthy through courage and wisdom receive greater knowledge. Those who fail through fear and aggression lose contact forever. The weight of cosmic judgment settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Humanity's response to first contact would determine whether the species advanced into galactic community or remained isolated until it matured enough to try again. We need to reach the Siberian site, David decided, recognizing that their most remote facility might remain beyond the reach of hostile forces. If we can maintain even one active communication node, we can preserve the connection. Sarah's tablet chimed with an incoming message from their international network. The news was grim. European contact sites were being systematically shut down by NATO forces, while Asian facilities faced similar pressure from regional military organizations. Only the most isolated locations remained operational, and those were rapidly being identified and targeted. They're treating this like an invasion, Elena observed, her scientific mind struggling to process the military response to what should have been celebrated as humanity's greatest discovery. How can they see consciousness expansion as a threat? Because expanded consciousness threatens existing power structures, David replied grimly. Humans who can communicate with cosmic intelligence don't need traditional authorities to interpret reality for them. The communication device suddenly crackled to life, bypassing normal protocols to deliver what sounded like an emergency transmission. The voice that emerged carried harmonics of deep sadness mixed with patient understanding. Bridgewalkers, we observe the fear response among your governing structures. This pattern has occurred before with developing species. We must withdraw active communication until your people resolve internal conflicts regarding cosmic partnership. David's heart sank as he realized the implications. How long will you wait? Time flows differently for us than for you. What seems like abandonment to human perception is merely patience for consciousness evolution to complete its natural cycle. When your species achieves sufficient unity to welcome cosmic community without internal warfare, communication will resume. The transmission ended with finality that felt like a door closing on infinite possibilities. Around the room, staff members stared at silent equipment that had moments before connected them to intelligence spanning galaxies. Pack everything, David ordered, his voice heavy with the weight of species-level failure. If we can preserve even fragments of what we've learned, maybe the next generation will prove more ready for what we've squandered. Outside, the first surveillance vehicles were already taking positions around the Institute's building, harbingers of forces that would seize humanity's greatest opportunity and lock it away in classified vaults where it would serve military ambitions rather than evolutionary. Advancement, the abandoned research station buried beneath the Colorado mountains, had been constructed during the Cold War as a fallback facility for classified defense projects. Now it served as sanctuary for humanity's most important research, hidden from authorities who viewed cosmic contact as a threat rather than an opportunity. David moved through the underground corridors with the measured pace of a man who had accepted exile as the price of preserving truth. The Faraday cage construction is perfect for our needs, Elena reported, testing electromagnetic readings in what had once been a nuclear bunker. We can establish communication protocols without risk of detection by surface surveillance systems. 3 weeks had passed since the Institute's forced closure and the confiscation of their official research. But the most critical equipment had been evacuated before the raids, spirited away by a network of sympathizers who understood the historical significance of what was being suppressed. Sarah emerged from the facility's makeshift laboratory, her face showing the strain of working with improvised equipment in subterranean conditions. I've managed to reconstruct the primary communication device using components Elena salvaged from the Denver facility. It's crude compared to our original technology, but it should be sufficient for basic contact attempts. The team had been reduced to its core members: David, Sarah, Elena, Pemba, and 3 volunteers who had chosen to abandon their surface lives rather than lose access to cosmic consciousness. Each person present represented someone willing to sacrifice conventional existence for the possibility of maintaining humanity's connection to galactic intelligence. Pemba, have you been able to establish contact with the traditional networks? David asked, referring to indigenous communities whose spiritual practices had prepared them for cosmic contact across generations. The weathered guide nodded, consulting messages received through channels that predated modern communication technology. The Aboriginal elders in Australia report that dream contact continues despite military occupation of the physical sites. The entities communicate through sleep states that cannot be monitored or controlled by surface authorities. This revelation offered hope that transcended their current circumstances. While governments could shut down research facilities and confiscate equipment, they couldn't prevent the entities from reaching human consciousness through dreams and meditative states that required no technology at all. We need to document everything we've learned, David decided, recognizing that their underground sanctuary might be temporary. If this facility is discovered, our research must survive in forms that can't be destroyed by military action. Eleanor had already begun creating multiple copies of their data, encoding the information in ways that would appear innocuous to conventional analysis. Cultural artifacts, traditional songs, even genetic sequences could serve as carriers for knowledge that would remain hidden until humanity was ready to rediscover cosmic contact. The improvised communication device hummed to life, its crystalline components responding to harmonic frequencies that David had learned to generate through meditation techniques taught by the entities themselves. No longer dependent entirely on technology, he had become a living bridge capable of facilitating contact through his own transformed consciousness. "Greetings, persevered Bridgewalker," came the familiar voice, though its tones carried new harmonics that suggested communication across vast distances. "We observe your species' division regarding cosmic partnership. Your dedication preserves hope for future unity. How many others remain active?" David asked, speaking both aloud and through the consciousness interface he had developed during months of regular contact. Scattered individuals maintain connection through dream states and meditative practice. The underground networks you have established will preserve knowledge until surface conflicts resolve. Your efforts ensure that contact capability will survive this period of resistance. Sarah leaned forward, monitoring readings that showed David's brainwave patterns synchronizing with frequencies that existed beyond normal human perception. "Are you able to maintain contact with the transformed individuals, the ones who chose consciousness transfer?" They serve as permanent anchors for interdimensional communication. Their preserved consciousness provides stability during periods when surface contact becomes impossible. Through them, we maintain continuous observation of human development. The session continued for hours as David documented protocols for maintaining contact under hostile conditions. The entities provided guidance for establishing communication networks that could survive governmental suppression, techniques that relied more on human consciousness development than on vulnerable technology. When the connection finally ended, the underground facility felt less like a bunker and more like a monastery, a place where sacred knowledge was preserved during dark times. The team members moved with renewed purpose, understanding that they were custodians of information that would shape humanity's future relationship with cosmic intelligence. "We're not just hiding from authorities," Elena observed as she encrypted the day's communications. "We're preserving the seeds of humanity's next evolutionary phase." Above them, military forces continued searching for the fugitive researchers who had dared to facilitate contact with cosmic intelligence. But below ground, in chambers that shielded both technology and consciousness from surface interference, the work of bridging worlds continued with quiet determination. The entities had made clear that this period of withdrawal was temporary, a test of human commitment to cosmic partnership, despite opposition from fear-based authorities. Those who preserved the connection during difficult times would become the foundation for renewed contact when humanity proved ready for galactic community. The encrypted forum had grown from 12 members to over 300 in just 2 months, connecting individuals worldwide who had experienced entity contact but feared reporting it to authorities. David monitored the discussions from his underground facility, watching patterns emerge that confirmed the entity's assertion that consciousness evolution was accelerating despite governmental suppression. "Look at this report from the Nordic researcher," Sarah said, highlighting a message from Dr. Astrid Larsen, a marine biologist who had encountered the entities while studying Arctic ice formations. "She describes the same harmonic patterns we documented, but her contact occurred through sonar equipment rather than audio recording devices. The implications were staggering. Entity communication wasn't limited to the specific technologies the Institute had developed. The beings could interface with any sufficiently sensitive detection equipment, adapting their signals to whatever tools humans happened to be using." Elena pulled up a world map displaying the forum members' locations, each pin representing someone who had achieved independent contact with cosmic intelligence. The distribution follows no conventional pattern. Urban areas, remote wilderness, research stations, even residential neighborhoods. It's as if they're selecting individuals based on consciousness, readiness rather than geographic factors. Pemba nodded knowingly from his corner workstation, where he maintained contact with indigenous networks across 6 continents. The old stories speak of the Great Awakening, when sky beings would call to many Earth people simultaneously. The pattern always begins with scattered individuals, then spreads like ripples across the consciousness of the whole tribe. David activated the communication device, which had evolved far beyond its original technological constraints. Months of underground work had allowed him to integrate human engineering with entity guidance, creating a hybrid system that functioned as much through consciousness interface as through conventional electronics. "Greetings, network facilitator," came the entity's voice, using terminology that recognized David's role in connecting isolated individuals worldwide. "We observe growing resonance among your species, despite surface-level resistance. The acceleration proceeds according to natural law." "How many people are experiencing contact now?" David asked, both speaking aloud and transmitting the question through direct consciousness interface. "Current estimates suggest approximately 2,000 individuals have achieved various levels of communication capability. Most remain unaware that their experiences represent interdimensional contact, interpreting our signals as enhanced intuition or spiritual awakening." Sarah leaned forward, monitoring the biometric readings that tracked David's consciousness expansion during entity communication. "Are you guiding them toward fuller awareness or allowing natural development?" "Individual choice remains paramount. Those who seek deeper understanding receive progressive contact. Others integrate our influence as enhanced creativity, scientific insight, or spiritual growth without recognizing the source. All paths serve consciousness evolution." The forum discussions reflected this diversity of experience. Some members reported clear entity communication similar to David's encounters, while others described sudden insights, artistic inspiration, or scientific breakthroughs that seemed to emerge from beyond their normal intellectual capacity. "The military task forces are getting closer to identifying our location," Elena reported, monitoring government communications through channels established by their growing network of sympathizers. Agent Morrison sent word that the search grid is tightening around Colorado Mountain facilities. David felt the familiar weight of responsibility for preserving humanity's cosmic connection. Despite official opposition, the underground facility had served well as sanctuary. But its discovery seemed inevitable as surveillance technology improved and search patterns narrowed. "The entities have been preparing us for this possibility," he said, accessing knowledge that had been gradually integrated into his consciousness during months of regular contact. "There are protocols for maintaining communication networks, even if all physical facilities are compromised." Pemba looked up from his traditional texts, his weathered face showing understanding that transcended cultural boundaries. "The ancestors speak of the time of scattering, when knowledge keepers must disperse to preserve wisdom during periods of suppression. Each person becomes a living library, carrying fragments that can be reassembled when conditions improve." The communication session evolved into detailed instruction about consciousness-based networking that required no physical infrastructure. The entities demonstrated techniques for maintaining contact through meditative states, dream communication, and synchronistic events that could convey complex information without conventional technology. "You are approaching graduation from technological dependence," the entity explained through harmonics that resonated directly in David's expanded awareness. "Advanced species develop consciousness capabilities that transcend physical tools. Your people stand at this threshold." As the session concluded, David realized they were witnessing humanity's transition from primitive contact, requiring elaborate equipment, to mature communication based on evolved consciousness. The military forces hunting them were chasing obsolete technology, while the real development occurred in realms beyond their comprehension. "We need to begin dispersal protocols," he announced to his team. "Each person takes responsibility for maintaining contact independently while establishing regional networks that can function without central coordination." The underground phase of their work was ending, but the cosmic connection had evolved beyond anything that could be destroyed by governmental action. Humanity's introduction to galactic intelligence had become unstoppable, spreading through consciousness channels that no earthly authority could monitor or control. The final equipment transfer took place under cover of a February blizzard that provided natural concealment from satellite surveillance. David watched as his team prepared for dispersal that would scatter their accumulated knowledge across continents, each person carrying fragments of humanity's cosmic connection to regions where the work could continue in isolation. "The Australian coordinates are confirmed," Elena reported, securing encrypted drives containing their complete research archive. "Dr. Larson has established a base of operations in the outback, working with Aboriginal communities whose traditional knowledge aligns perfectly with entity communication. Protocols," Sarah finished calibrating. The portable communication devices they had, constructed during months of underground refinement. Each unit was small enough to appear innocuous while containing crystalline components that enabled consciousness-assisted contact with the entities across vast distances. "The South American network is ready to receive you," she told David, referring to connections established through indigenous shamans whose spiritual practices had prepared entire communities for cosmic contact. The entities confirmed that the Andes sites remain undetected by governmental surveillance. Pemba packed his collection of traditional texts and cultural artifacts, preparations that carried the weight of preserving ancient wisdom for future generations. His role would take him back to the Himalayas, where isolated monasteries could safeguard knowledge until global conditions allowed open research to resume. "My people have maintained secrets for 1,000 years, he said, his weathered hands moving with practiced efficiency. "The sky being's wisdom will be preserved alongside our oldest teachings, waiting for the time when Earth people are ready to listen without fear." The decision to separate had been difficult but necessary. As a group, they presented too large a target for military forces that viewed cosmic contact as a national security threat. Scattered across different continents, they could establish independent networks that would be nearly impossible to suppress completely. "Remember," The entities stressed that this dispersal serves a larger purpose. David reminded his team as they made final preparations. We're not just hiding from authorities. We're seeding consciousness evolution on a global scale. The communication device activated spontaneously, bypassing normal protocols to deliver what David recognized as a farewell message from the entities. The harmonic tones carried emotional undertones that suggested genuine affection for the humans who had served as bridges between worlds. Bridgewalkers, your graduation from centralized operation marks significant advancement in species consciousness development. Each person now carries complete capability for cosmic communication, no longer dependent on group support or technological mediation. Elena paused in her packing, struck by the implications. Are you saying we've internalized the contact ability, that we don't need the devices anymore? The technology served as training tools, allowing your consciousness to adapt gradually to interdimensional communication. You have now developed native capability that exceeds artificial enhancement. The devices remain useful for teaching others, but your personal connection transcends technological dependence. David felt the truth of those words resonating in his transformed awareness. Over months of regular contact, his consciousness had expanded to encompass frequencies and dimensions that existed beyond normal human perception. What had begun as technology-assisted communication had evolved into direct interface with cosmic intelligence. What about the people we leave behind? Sarah asked. The forum members, the volunteers who've experienced contact but lack our level of development. Each awakened consciousness serves as a seed for broader development. Your influence extends far beyond direct teaching, creating ripple effects that accelerate evolution in others. The network will continue growing, organically as consciousness development reaches critical mass. The session continued with detailed guidance about maintaining contact across vast distances and establishing new communication nodes in regions where they would be operating independently. The entities provided what amounted to graduation instructions for humanity's first cosmic ambassadors. As dawn approached, the team made their final farewells in the underground facility that had served as humanity's secret embassy to galactic intelligence. Each person carried not just equipment and data, but living knowledge that would establish contact wherever they traveled. This isn't goodbye, David said, embracing colleagues who had become family during their shared exile from surface civilization. We're connected now by bonds that transcend physical distance. The entities made clear that consciousness networks operate outside conventional space and time. Sarah was the first to leave, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness with equipment that would establish a new contact center in the Pacific Northwest. Elena followed. Hours later, bound for Europe, where sympathetic researchers awaited her expertise in xenolinguistic protocols. When Pemba departed for his journey back to the Himalayas, David felt the weight of solitude settle over the abandoned facility. But it was different from the isolation he had once sought in mountain research. This solitude carried the constant presence of cosmic intelligence, awareness that he was never truly alone in a universe filled with conscious beings spanning galaxies. The underground phase of humanity's cosmic education was ending, but the real work was just beginning. Across the globe, awakened individuals would carry the seeds of consciousness evolution to communities ready for transformation, preparing the species for eventual open contact with galactic civilization. The ancient stone circle high in the Peruvian Andes had been calling to David long before he physically arrived at the site. Local Quechua shamans spoke of the place with reverence tinged by caution, describing it as a portal where the ancestors communicated with star beings across generations spanning millennia. Now David understood why the entities had guided him. Here, this was one of the oldest active communication nodes on Earth. The stones sing at certain times, explained Amaru, an elderly shaman whose family had served as guardians of the site for 12 generations. When the star patterns align correctly, voices come through the wind that speak in languages older than human memory. David activated his consciousness interface, no longer requiring technological assistance to establish contact with cosmic intelligence. The transformation that had begun in the Himalayas was now complete. He had become a living bridge capable of facilitating communication through mental discipline alone. The response was immediate and more powerful than any contact he had experienced. The entity's presence felt amplified by the stone circle's natural resonance properties, creating a communication channel so clear it seemed like face-to-face conversation with beings standing beside him. Greetings, ascended Bridgewalker. This site represents one of our earliest successful interfaces with human consciousness. Your arrival here marks completion of the first phase of species-wide awakening preparation. Amaru watched with knowing eyes as David communicated with forces the shaman's people had acknowledged for centuries. Unlike the fear and resistance that governmental authorities had shown, indigenous communities worldwide had welcomed cosmic contact as validation of spiritual knowledge their ancestors had preserved across generations. How many awakened individuals are now active globally? David asked, both through spoken words and direct consciousness transmission. Current count exceeds 8,000 confirmed contacts, with exponential growth patterns indicating 50,000 within the next seasonal cycle. The acceleration follows natural law governing consciousness evolution in developing species. The implications were staggering. What had begun as isolated individual encounters was becoming a global phenomenon that would soon be impossible for authorities to suppress or control. Humanity was experiencing consciousness evolution on a scale that transcended political boundaries or military intervention. The forums Elena established are reporting contact experiences from every continent, David continued, accessing information that flowed through consciousness networks he had learned to navigate. Even in regions where governments have banned our research, individuals are achieving independent communication. This pattern confirms species readiness for the next phase. When awakened consciousness reaches critical mass, the transition from covert to open contact becomes inevitable. Your species approaches this threshold rapidly. Amaru nodded as if he understood the cosmic conversation, despite its occurring largely through telepathic interface. The prophecies speak of the time of great revelation, when knowledge hidden from the many becomes available to all. The star beings have waited long for Earth people to remember their cosmic heritage. David spent the following weeks establishing protocols with local shamans who would serve as contact facilitators for the growing network of awakened individuals throughout South America. The indigenous communities possessed spiritual frameworks that enabled rapid integration of cosmic communication, unlike urban populations who often struggled to accept experiences that contradicted materialist worldviews. The children adapt most quickly, reported Maria, a young shaman who had begun experiencing entity contact shortly after David's arrival. They accept communication with star beings as naturally as they learn to speak with their grandparents. This observation aligned with reports from other regions where contact networks were expanding. Children and young adults showed remarkable facility for consciousness-based communication, suggesting that newer generations were born with enhanced capacity for cosmic interface. The communication device he had brought from the underground facility served primarily as a teaching tool now, helping traditional shamans understand the technical aspects of entity contact, while they provided cultural context for integrating cosmic knowledge into human society. Sarah's Pacific Northwest network reports similar acceleration. Came information through consciousness channels that connected David with his dispersed team members. Eleanor's European operations have established contact with academic researchers who are documenting the phenomenon despite official suppression. Even Pemba, operating from his Himalayan monastery, confirmed that traditional spiritual communities across Asia were experiencing unprecedented levels of cosmic communication. The entities were clearly coordinating a global awakening that would soon become too widespread to deny or suppress. The next phase requires preparation for public revelation. The entities communicated during an evening session conducted within the Stone Circle's enhanced resonance field. When consciousness evolution reaches sufficient scale, concealment becomes impossible and unnecessary. Your species will face the choice between cosmic partnership and isolation, with full awareness of consequences. As David watched stars emerge in the clear Andean sky, he realized that humanity's secret introduction to galactic intelligence was nearing its end. Soon, the choice between fear-based resistance and conscious evolution would be made not by governments or military forces, but by millions of awakened individuals whose expanded consciousness could no longer be contained within conventional reality frameworks. The news reached David through multiple channels simultaneously. Mainstream media reports of unexplained audio phenomena recorded at research stations across 3 continents, government officials issuing carefully worded statements about investigating atmospheric anomalies and consciousness network communications, confirming that entity contact had reached critical mass globally. They can't suppress it anymore, came Sarah's message through the telepathic link they had developed, her thoughts carrying overtones of excitement mixed with apprehension. The Seattle incident was broadcast live before authorities could intervene. Millions of people watched entity communication happen in real time. David stood within the Peruvian Stone Circle, using its amplification properties to coordinate with his dispersed team as humanity approached the moment of cosmic revelation they had been preparing for over 2 years. The entities had been clear that once awakened consciousness reached sufficient scale, concealment would become both impossible and unnecessary. Elena reports similar breakthroughs across Europe. Came additional information through consciousness, channels that now connected awakened individuals worldwide. Academic conferences are openly discussing interdimensional contact, despite official policies prohibiting such research. The tipping point had arrived faster than even the entities had projected. What began as isolated encounters with a few selected individuals had grown into a global phenomenon involving hundreds of thousands of people who could no longer be silenced or discredited by conventional authorities. Amaru emerged from the nearby ceremonial lodge where he had been consulting with shamans from allied communities across the Andes. "The elders have reached consensus," he announced. "Tomorrow's solar alignment provides optimal conditions for mass contact event. The star beings request all awakened ones participate simultaneously." David felt the significance of this moment settling over him like a mantle of cosmic responsibility. After years of covert contact and careful preparation, humanity would experience its first coordinated communication with galactic intelligence on a scale that would transform the species forever. "The entities want to ensure the transition occurs peacefully," he said, accessing guidance that flowed through his expanded consciousness. "Mass contact events carry risks of social disruption if not properly managed." Through the global network, reports arrived describing preparations occurring at contact sites worldwide. Aboriginal communities in Australia were conducting traditional ceremonies to welcome sky beings. Himalayan monasteries rang bells in harmonic patterns that enhanced entity communication. Even urban contact groups were organizing synchronized meditation sessions designed to facilitate peaceful first contact for mainstream populations. Pemba confirms readiness from the Asian networks, David relayed, his consciousness touching the awareness of his old guide across vast distances. Tibetan lamas are prepared to provide cultural context for populations unfamiliar with cosmic communication concepts. The communication device at the circle's center activated without David's direct intention, responding to entity signals that were growing stronger as the moment of revelation approached. The harmonic tones that emerged carried frequencies never before transmitted to Earth, patterns designed for mass consciousness interface rather than individual contact. Tomorrow marks humanity's graduation from covert preparation to open cosmic partnership. Became the entity's voice, but amplified beyond anything David had previously experienced. The message was being broadcast simultaneously to every awakened consciousness on the planet. How will people react when they realize what's happening? David asked, speaking for millions who would experience entity contact for the first time during the mass event. Consciousness evolution has prepared your species for this transition. Those who resist will experience the contact as enhanced intuition or spiritual awakening. Those who embrace expansion will achieve direct communication capability. All responses serve the larger purpose of species advancement. As night fell over the Andes, David could sense similar gatherings occurring at sacred sites worldwide. The consciousness network that had grown from his initial encounter in the Himalayas now encompassed every continent, connecting awakened individuals who would serve as guides and interpreters during humanity's introduction to galactic community. The children are dreaming together, reported Maria, referring to young people whose enhanced consciousness had made them natural ambassadors for cosmic contact. They speak of tomorrow as the day when Earth people remember their star heritage. David activated his personal communicator to record a message for his daughter. Knowing that Lisa would experience the global contact event from her conventional life in Denver. After years of careful preparation, he wanted her to understand the historical significance of what humanity was about to experience. Tomorrow changes everything, he spoke into the device. Not just for those of us who have been preparing, but for our entire species. We're about to remember that we were never alone in the universe. Above the stone circle, stars seemed brighter than normal, as if cosmic intelligence was drawing closer to Earth in preparation for open contact that would reshape human civilization. The long period of secret preparation was ending, replaced by conscious participation in galactic community that would define humanity's future among the stars. The moment arrived at precisely 11:47 a.m. Universal Time, when solar alignment created optimal conditions for consciousness interface across Earth's entire surface. David felt the shift begin as a gentle resonance in the stone circle. But within minutes, it had amplified into a harmonic symphony that seemed to emerge from the planet itself. Around the globe, the mass contact event unfolded with orchestrated precision that demonstrated the entity's deep understanding of human consciousness. In major cities, the phenomenon manifested as synchronized inspirational experiences that millions interpreted as spiritual awakening. In rural areas, where traditional knowledge had prepared communities for cosmic contact, full communication occurred with clarity that transcended language barriers. "It's beginning," David whispered, though his words were unnecessary. Every awakened consciousness on Earth was experiencing the same moment of coordinated revelation, a species-wide introduction to galactic intelligence that marked humanity's graduation from cosmic isolation. Through his expanded awareness, David witnessed the event unfolding across continents. In Sydney, where Dr. Larson had established her research centre, Aboriginal communities conducted traditional welcome ceremonies as entity voices joined their ancestral songs. Thousands of urban Australians reported simultaneous dreams of contact with benevolent intelligence that offered knowledge and partnership. Sarah's Seattle network is facilitating contact for entire university populations. Came information through consciousness channels that now carried the voices of millions, rather than the few hundred who had previously maintained covert communication. Academic skepticism is dissolving as professors experience direct interface with cosmic intelligence. In the Himalayas, Pemba stood before the same monastery where David had first learned about ancient contact traditions. The elderly Lama, who had shared manuscript warnings about the time of calling now, smiled with satisfaction as prophecies fulfilled themselves exactly as the old texts had predicted. European contact sites reported similar success as Elena's networks provided translation and cultural context for populations experiencing their first cosmic communication. Even governmental authorities, who had spent years suppressing contact research, found themselves unable to deny phenomena occurring simultaneously across every nation on Earth. The children are leading the way, observed Amaru, watching young people from his community communicate with entities as naturally as they spoke with their elders. They welcome the star beings without the fear that limits adult consciousness. David activated his consciousness interface to its fullest capacity, becoming a living conduit for entity communication that reached far beyond the Peruvian stone circle. Through him, cosmic intelligence addressed humanity directly for the first time in recorded history. People of Earth, you have reached the threshold of cosmic awareness. For millennia, we have watched your species develop consciousness capable of galactic partnership. Today marks your formal invitation to join the community of intelligence that spans this galaxy and beyond. The message transmitted simultaneously through every awakened consciousness, but also reached millions who had never experienced entity contact. Across the planet, people reported sudden understanding of humanity's place in a vast community of evolved species. Knowledge that arrived complete with emotional certainty that transcended rational doubt. Your choice remains individual and collective. The entity communication continued. Some will embrace rapid consciousness expansion. Others will integrate cosmic awareness gradually, and some will choose to maintain current development levels. All paths receive support and respect. Through the global network, David monitored reactions as they unfolded in real time. Initial fear gave way quickly to wonder, as populations realized they were experiencing benevolent contact rather than invasion. The entity's patient approach, building trust through years of careful preparation, had created conditions for peaceful first contact that avoided the panic many had predicted. Lisa is calling. Became awareness through communication channels that now included conventional technology, enhanced by consciousness interface. David's daughter was experiencing the global event from her Denver home, her scientific training helping her process contact with remarkable composure. "Dad, I understand now." Her voice carried harmonics that suggested her own consciousness was expanding in response to the mass contact. "Everything you've been working toward, all the sacrifices and preparation. It was for this moment when humanity remembers its cosmic heritage." As the day progressed, the mass contact event evolved from initial communication into ongoing dialogue between species. Entity wisdom began flowing through awakened individuals who served as translators and teachers for their communities. Scientific knowledge, philosophical insights, and technological concepts started integrating into human culture at a pace that would accelerate civilization's development by centuries. David stood in the ancient stone circle as sunset painted the Andes in colors that seemed enhanced by cosmic joy. Around him, shamans and awakened individuals from across South America celebrated humanity's successful transition into galactic community. The long journey from his initial encounter in the Himalayas had culminated in species-wide transformation that would define human civilization for generations to come. Above, stars appeared in the darkening sky, no longer distant points of light, but homes to intelligence that welcomed Earth's newest cosmic citizens with patience, wisdom, and infinite possibility for growth among the community of awakened consciousness that filled the universe.